The Dawson's Field hijackings, which took place between September 6 and September 12, 1970, marked one of the most audacious and complex acts of air piracy in the history of modern terrorism. Orchestrated by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, a radical Marxist-Leninist group within the broader Palestinian liberation movement, the operation involved the simultaneous hijacking of 4 commercial airliners. 3 of these aircraft were ultimately diverted to a remote desert airstrip in Jordan, known as Dawson's Field, while the 4th was taken to Cairo and destroyed. The hijackings were not merely acts of terror, but were deeply political in nature, designed to draw global attention to the Palestinian cause and to pressure Western governments into releasing Palestinian and other militants held in prisons across Europe and Israel. The events that unfolded over those 7 days would have far-reaching consequences, not only for the Middle East, but also for international aviation security and the global perception of terrorism. The PFLP, led by the charismatic and militant George Habash, was a faction that believed in the necessity of armed struggle to achieve Palestinian liberation. Unlike the more mainstream Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, the PFLP rejected purely diplomatic solutions and sought to radicalize the Palestinian resistance through dramatic and violent acts. The hijackings were part of a broader strategy to internationalize the Palestinian struggle, forcing the world to acknowledge their grievances. The choice of targeting commercial airliners was deliberate. Air travel was a symbol of Western modernity and connectivity, and attacking it guaranteed maximum media coverage. The PFLP's demands were clear: the release of Layla Khaled, a prominent PFLP operative who had been captured during a failed hijacking attempt days earlier, as well as the freeing of other Palestinian and pro-Palestinian militants imprisoned. In Switzerland, West Germany and Israel, the hijackings began on September 6, 1970, when a PFLP team successfully seized control of El Al Flight 2119 from Amsterdam to New York. This hijacking, however, was thwarted by the plane's security team, and the lone hijacker, Patrick Arguello, was killed during the struggle. Layla Khaled, who was also on board, was subdued and arrested when the plane made an emergency landing in London. The failure of this hijacking did not deter the PFLP, which had already set in motion a backup plan. Later that same day, a TWA Boeing 707 flying from Frankfurt to New York was hijacked by 2 PFLP operatives and diverted to Dawson's Field, a deserted airstrip in the Jordanian desert that had been used by the British Royal Air Force during World War II. The following day, September 7th, a Swissair DC-8 en route from Zurich to New York was also seized and forced to land at the same location. On September 9th, a third aircraft, a BOAC VC-10, flying from Bombay to London, was hijacked and brought to Dawson's Field. A fourth plane, a Pan Am 747, was hijacked on September 6th and flown to Cairo, where it was evacuated and then blown up in a symbolic act of defiance. The convergence of 3 large commercial airliners at Dawson's Field created a surreal and unprecedented spectacle. The hijackers, armed and masked, held over 300 passengers and crew members hostage in the sweltering desert heat. The conditions were harsh, with limited food, water, and medical supplies. The hostages, many of whom were American and European citizens, were subjected to psychological torment as the hijackers negotiated with authorities. The PFLP's demands were broadcast globally, and the crisis dominated international news. The hijackers released all non-Israeli and non-Jewish hostages within days, a move that underscored the ideological nature of their struggle. The remaining hostages, primarily Jewish passengers and flight crew, were kept as bargaining chips. The Jordanian government, led by King Hussein, found itself in an untenable position. The presence of armed Palestinian militants operating with impunity on Jordanian soil was a direct challenge to the monarchy's authority. The PFLP's actions were part of a broader pattern of Palestinian groups acting as a state within a state, undermining Hussein's control. The hijackings were the final straw in a series of escalating tensions between the Jordanian government and Palestinian factions, culminating in what would later be known as Black September. By mid-September, Jordanian forces launched a full-scale military offensive against the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, leading to a bloody civil war that would reshape the dynamics of the Middle East. The international response to the hijackings was one of shock and condemnation. Western governments, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, pressured Jordan to secure the release of the hostages. Behind the scenes, intense diplomatic negotiations took place, with intermediaries shuttling between the hijackers, the Jordanian government, and Western officials. The PFLP's demands were partially met. Several prisoners held in Europe were released in exchange for the hostages. On September 12th, the remaining hostages at Dawson's Field were freed, and the hijackers were granted safe passage to an undisclosed location. The 3 aircraft, however, were destroyed in a dramatic explosion that was broadcast live on television, symbolizing the PFLP's defiance and the futility of Western attempts to ignore the Palestinian struggle. The Dawson's Field hijackings had profound and lasting implications. For the PFLP, the operation was a tactical success, elevating their profile and demonstrating their capability to strike at the heart of the Western world. However, it also alienated many moderate Palestinians and Arab states who saw the hijackings as counterproductive to the broader cause. The events accelerated the rift between Jordan and the PLO, leading to the expulsion of Palestinian fighters from Jordan and their relocation to Lebanon, where they would continue their struggle but also sow the seeds for future conflicts. For the international community, the hijackings were a wake-up call. They exposed the vulnerabilities of civil aviation and prompted a rapid overhaul of airport security measures. Sky marshals, metal detectors, and stricter passenger screening became standard practices in the years that followed. The hijackings also set a precedent for the use of terrorism as a tool of political coercion, inspiring other militant groups to adopt similar tactics. The PFLP's ability to commandeer multiple aircraft simultaneously demonstrated the potential for coordinated large-scale terrorist operations, a lesson that would be tragically revisited decades later on September 11, 2001. The Dawson's Field hijackings also had a significant cultural and psychological impact. They reinforced the image of the Palestinian struggle in the Western imagination, often framing it as a movement defined by extremism and violence. For Palestinians, the hijackings were a double-edged sword. While they brought attention to their plight, they also cemented a narrative that would be used to justify their marginalization. The events of September 1970 became a defining moment in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, illustrating the lengths to which some factions were willing to go to achieve their goals. In retrospect, the Dawson's Field hijackings were a product of their time, reflecting the radicalism and desperation of a stateless people seeking recognition and justice. The PFLP's actions, though condemned by many, were rooted in a broader context of displacement, occupation, and political failure. The hijackings were not an isolated act, but part of a continuum of resistance and violence that has characterized the Palestinian struggle for decades. The legacy of Dawson's Field is complex, embodying both the extremes of militant activism and the enduring quest for Palestinian self-determination. The aftermath of the hijackings saw the PFLP marginalized within the Palestinian movement, as Fatah and the PLO under Arafat sought to present a more moderate face to the world. However, the tactics pioneered by the PFLP would be emulated by other groups, and the spectre of aerial hijackings would haunt global aviation for years to come. The destruction of the planes at Dawson's Field was a symbolic act, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in which terrorism would increasingly target civilians and exploit the media to amplify its message. The Dawson's Field hijackings also highlighted the role of the media in modern terrorism. The hijackers were acutely aware of the power of television and radio to broadcast their demands and amplify their cause. The images of the stranded planes in the desert, the masked guerrillas, and the terrified hostages were beamed around the world, creating a spectacle that was impossible to ignore. This media strategy would become a hallmark of future terrorist operations, as groups sought to manipulate public perception and exert psychological pressure on governments. For Jordan, the hijackings were a pivotal moment that forced King Hussein to confront the growing power of Palestinian militias within his borders. The subsequent crackdown, known as Black September, was brutal but effective in reasserting Jordanian sovereignty. The conflict, however, left deep scars and further polarized the Arab world. The expulsion of the PLO from Jordan shifted the center of Palestinian activism to Lebanon, where it would contribute to the destabilization of that country and the outbreak of civil war in 1975. The Dawson's Field hijackings remain a subject of study for historians, security experts, and political analysts. They represent a turning point in the history of terrorism, illustrating the shift from localized acts of violence to international spectacles designed for global consumption. The hijackings also underscored the interconnectedness of the modern world, where events in a remote desert airstrip could reverberate across continents and influence the course of history. In the decades since, the tactics and motivations of the PFLP have been analyzed and debated. Some view the hijackings as a legitimate, if extreme, form of resistance against oppression, while others see them as indefensible acts of terror that targeted innocent civilians. The moral and political ambiguities of the Dawson's Field operation reflect the broader complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where narratives of justice and violence are deeply intertwined. The Dawson's Field hijackings also had a personal dimension for the hostages, many of whom were profoundly traumatized by their ordeal. Their stories, often overlooked in the broader political narrative, provide a human perspective on the events. For some, the experience was a harrowing brush with mortality. For others, it was a catalyst for deeper engagement with the political issues at stake. The hostages' release was a moment of relief, but for many, the psychological scars endured long after they returned home. The hijackings also influenced the evolution of international law and counterterrorism strategies. In the years that followed, conventions were adopted to criminalize air piracy and strengthen cooperation between nations in combating terrorism. The events at Dawson's Field demonstrated the need for a coordinated global response to transnational threats, a lesson that remains relevant in an era of increasingly sophisticated and decentralized terrorist networks. The PFLP's role in the hijackings cemented its reputation as a vanguard of revolutionary violence, but it also isolated the group from more mainstream political processes. While the PFLP continued to operate, its influence waned as the Palestinian movement gravitated toward diplomatic avenues, particularly after the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. Nonetheless, the legacy of Dawson's Field endures as a symbol of the radical tactics that have shaped the Palestinian struggle. The hijackings also had a lasting impact on the perception of the Middle East in the West. They reinforced stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims as inherently violent and irrational, contributing to a climate of fear and mistrust. This perception would be exacerbated by subsequent acts of terrorism, further complicating efforts at dialogue and reconciliation. In the broader context of Cold War politics, the Dawson's field hijackings were a reminder of how regional conflicts could be exploited by global powers. The PFLP's Marxist ideology aligned it with the Soviet bloc, while Western governments viewed the hijackings as part of a broader threat to their interests in the Middle East. The crisis thus became another front in the ideological struggle between East and West, with the Palestinians caught in the middle. The destruction of the planes at Dawson's Field was a theatrical finale to the crisis, but it also symbolized the futility of violence as a means of achieving lasting political change. While the hijackings succeeded in drawing attention to the Palestinian cause, they did little to advance the goal of statehood or justice. Instead, they perpetuated a cycle of retaliation and repression that continues to this day. The Dawson's Field hijackings of September 1970 were a watershed moment in the history of terrorism and the Palestinian struggle. They demonstrated the power of spectacular violence to capture the world's attention, but they also revealed the limitations of such tactics in achieving meaningful political progress. The events of those 7 days in the Jordanian desert remain a potent reminder of the complexities and consequences of armed resistance, and their legacy continues to shape the Middle East and the world. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown fascinating, hit that subscribe button and share this video with fellow history buffs.